When you grow up in excessive affluence, it tends to skew your concept of normal. And I say that as someone whose normal is erratic, to say the least. But I promise, that perspective matters. It matters a lot if you're to understand the story I'm about to tell. And trust me, this story needs to be told, because the implications are troubling. Very, very troubling. Now, for me personally, well, my background has always complicated my perspectives. That's pretty much unavoidable when you've grown up a certain way and had that way upended on more than one occasion. I spent much of my life trying not to think about it, but I just can't ignore it anymore. Not after what I've recently uncovered. You see, I was born into a pretty wealthy family. I won't name names or list net worth, because that name and everything related to it, chances are it's already been scrubbed from most records, and for reasons that will soon make a disturbing bit of sense. But the numbers and the names don't matter. All you really need to know about my early life is that I grew up in a house with no fewer than 6 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms, and that it was in a gated community that valued privacy more than most. It's also worth noting that I was a bit of a black sheep in this family. I was the youngest of 6 kids, but I never really fit in with the rest of my siblings. They were all about competing for family status, building their own brand and trying to stand out from every other rich kid on the block. But me, I just never really cared. I would rather sit around, play my guitar, watch old movies, and smoke a bowl of weed. And yeah, my parents didn't exactly approve. My mother especially belittled me to no end for not living up to the family name, and for not showing much ambition. But my siblings were all too eager to ignore me, not seeing me as a threat to any of their goals. So naturally, I spent more times around the various maids, butlers, chefs, and groundskeepers that were constantly working throughout the house. Whenever I needed to confide in anyone, I'd go to them before I went to anyone in my family. I mean, hell, I got along better with the family security chief, Max, more than anyone of my relatives. He even smoked weed with me from time to time. It was, by every measure, a very twisted world of normal. I mean, I grew up in a house with servants and maids, for crying out loud, catering and pampering me at every turn. I never wanted for anything. My every surrounding was just so comfortable. I won't say it had no downsides, but make no mistake, it's a life that many would envy, and for entirely understandable reasons. But that life was always hanging by a thread, and I didn't learn why until I was a teenager. My family might have come from old money, but my father really shook things up when he reinvested our wealth in new fields, mostly tech and biotech. Nobody knew all the details. Even my mother was in the dark, at least at first. But even though I tried to keep my distance from all the accounting and financials, I did notice it made a lot of people nervous, even people outside my family. Every time someone tried to get more details on these companies that my dad was investing in, they hit a dead end. I mean, you could look at our tax returns and see their names, but if you tried to learn anything more about them or the kinds of products they made or the kind of research they did, it would get ugly. On more than one occasion, I remember some serious, profanity-laced shouting matches between my dad, my mom, and all our business partners. And it all came to a head one day when, without warning, all our security, maids, chefs, and assistants just didn't show up. I still remember my older sister whining endlessly about having to cook her own breakfast for once. But on that same morning, my father dropped a hell of a bombshell. A good chunk of our assets had been frozen by the bank. Our money wasn't gone, but someone, he didn't say who, was blocking our access to it. And he didn't know when or if they could get it back. Needless to say, that did not go over well. There was just so much yelling and cursing from my mother, my brothers, my sisters. It was genuinely painful to listen to. It was like in that one singular moment, every semblance of familial bond, every trace of love, affection, and loyalty, it all just vanished. And in its place was this frothing, greed-fueled hatred. Eventually, one of my brothers actually took a swing at my father, and then they started fighting each other. And then, well, I didn't really stick around for much longer after that. I opted to say as little as possible, and honestly, I didn't even want to know all the details. For all I knew, that information would make me liable or something. Ignorance, in this case, was my most valuable asset. The weeks and months that followed were a bit of a blur. I managed to work with my uncle, who was an independent accountant, to get whatever money I could. I then decided to just put some distance between me and my family. I ended up moving several states over, setting up shop in a modest 2-bedroom apartment. I won't say it was fancy. I'll just say that it did not come with a hot tub or a sauna. And honestly, it was a hell of an adjustment, and not in a good way. I basically had to learn how to live my life without maids, servants, and security. And that sucked, for lack of a better word. If that makes me sound like a spoiled rich kid, so be it. Black sheep or not, I don't deny that I was used to a life of affluence. And now I had to get used to a different kind of life. I won't say it was outright poverty. I did have enough money to sustain myself for an extended period. But I was warned repeatedly that it could be frozen at any time and without warning. So I had to make it last. And I had to adapt. And after a couple years, I like to think I adapted well. I mean, I got a part-time job at a music store. I also worked at a weed dispensary for a while. Now, at times, my spoiled side did show. Early on, I felt genuinely disheartened that someone like me had to work menial jobs now. But over time, I kind of grew to like it. I mean, yeah, it was hard and frustrating, but it was also a lot simpler and less complicated. I didn't have to constantly worry about family affairs, investments, or wealth management. I just went to work, made my money, and went home. It may not sound ideal, especially for someone who didn't grow up rich, but it worked for me. And while I was living this new life, I kept a low profile. I didn't even use my full legal name. I knew my family was still out there, fighting with my dad over the family wealth. But I wanted no part in that fight. Now, if my story ended there and I just cut myself off from my family completely, I'd have probably been fine. Hell, I would probably be on my porch right now, smoking a joint and playing my guitar. But then my family, and that affluent world I came from, it eventually caught up with me. It started about 6 months ago. That was when I got the terrible, unexpected news that my mother had died. And even though I was pretty distant from my family at that point, it still hit hard. But beyond the shock of the news, I also learned something else disturbing. My siblings were increasingly difficult to get a hold of. At first I thought they were just constantly going after our dad, trying to unlock our money. But the way my lawyer described it, it almost sounded like they were on the run or something. Only 2 of them showed up at Mom's funeral, my oldest sister and brother. They didn't say much. They didn't even speak at the service. They just looked distraught by something, and it didn't have much to do with Mom's death. I tried to reconnect with them. I even tried to stay in touch with them. But we just burned too many bridges, said too many things that we couldn't take back. Our blood relation, it just didn't amount to much anymore. The only real detail I got came from my brother. This was actually the last voicemail he ever left me.
Look, little bro, I gotta go away for a bit. Business in Europe. Not the kind I can discuss over the phone. But it does have to do with Dad. I think he was involved in something. Something that went beyond your typical investment scheme. I can't say much, but I'll just say this. If Dad reaches out to you, do not listen. Stay as far away from him as you can.
Not gonna lie, his message really freaked me out. Even if I wasn't on good terms with my family, I never felt threatened by them. This didn't even feel like a threat. It felt more like a warning. And in hindsight, I really wish I had listened. Again, I tried to just shut it all out. I went back to my humble apartment, my part-time job, and my non-affluent lifestyle. I mourned my mother's death, but I didn't dare dwell on it too much. I didn't even think about trying to reach out to my father. Personally, I hoped he'd forgotten about me, content to just cut ties with the black sheep of our family. But maybe it was because I was so different that he eventually did. That happened about 6 weeks ago, I think. My sense of time is kind of messed up right now. But I'm fairly certain that's how long ago it was when a man calling himself Abe showed up at my doorstep. Now, if you saw Abe on the street, you probably wouldn't give him a second look. He's this tall, somewhat lanky guy with tan skin, short hair, and a somewhat grizzled complexion. But if you spoke to him for more than 5 minutes, you definitely sensed that something was off with him. I certainly sensed it. The way the guy stood, spoke, and looked at me was so stiff, for lack of a better word. He didn't say much. He barely spoke in complete sentences. But I knew my father was involved because Abe gave me this letter. This simple, handwritten letter that might have been the last thing he ever wrote. And this is what it said. Son, if you're reading this, then Abe made it to you safely. For that, I am grateful. I know things between me and your siblings haven't been great lately. That is largely my fault, and mine alone. As I write this, I'm trying to work a few things out. I hope to give you and your siblings the full story when the time is right. And I can assure you that time is soon. But until then, I need you to let Abe stay with you. In the meantime, he's agreed to serve you, just like our old maids and butlers. He can cook, clean, and tend to whatever you need. Just make sure he stays with you. Make sure nobody else finds him. I'm sorry I have to place this burden on you, but if ever there was a time when I needed my kids to trust me, it's this. It'll all make sense very soon. You have my word on that. Sorry, I still don't know how to feel about that. I will say this. He did end up keeping his word, just not in the way he probably intended. Now remember, my brother warned me about this. He told me in no uncertain terms to stay away from Dad or anything involved with him. This situation was a weird situation with all sorts of red flags, and I had plenty of reasons to call up my lawyer and tell him about Abe, and use this letter to protect myself against my family. But that's not what I did. Instead, I chose to honor my father's wishes, believing I was actually doing the right thing. But that fateful choice, it doomed whatever chance I had left of living a halfway normal life. Initially, I really did think I made the right call. I even felt genuinely encouraged. Once I let Abe into my place, the guy went to work. I didn't even ask him to, but he basically became the perfect servant. He cooked perfect meals, cleaned every inch of my apartment, took care of all my bills, my laundry, and groceries. He even tuned my guitar. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of enjoyed it. Suddenly, it was like living at the old family estate again. Every menial chore and task was taken care of for me. Abe never got tired or sick. He slept maybe 2 to 3 hours a night, rarely went to the bathroom, and only ever ate cheap oatmeal. Even when I offered him some of my own food, he would politely refuse. The only words he ever said to me were some variation of,
"I live to serve, and serve I shall."
I thought he was just being overly formal. But the truth, well, that I only learned when I made my biggest and possibly my last mistake. I swear, I just made some offhand comment. At the music shop I worked at, this cute girl talked me up, asking questions about guitars, music, and where to score some good weed. Plenty of other girls had talked to me just like that, and it had never been an issue. But then she had to go and comment about my lunch, which Abe had made. And, me being careless in the moment, I mentioned him. It was only minor. I just said my roommate Abe made it for me, and that got a strange reaction from her. She started asking more questions. I don't remember saying much. I just kept calling him my roommate, someone who my father knew and who was staying with me. That ended up being another slip of the tongue, something I didn't realize until after I'd said it. I tried to walk it back. I also tried to change the subject, but the girl, now looking really tense, just up and left. I didn't realize until much later that she'd been working with a private investigator, the kind certain people hire when they want to uncover your deepest, darkest secrets. And when I went home that evening, I didn't think I'd revealed too much. I didn't intend to bring it up with Abe. I just hoped to smoke a joint and forget about it. But as soon as I walked in the door, as soon as I confronted Abe, I knew something was up. For one, he was on the phone with someone. That shouldn't have been possible. He didn't have a phone, and I never gave him one. Second, he had this look in his eye. This deep, menacing look that I'd never seen before. It was so inhuman, as though there was no thinking, feeling person behind it. And when he looked at me, I felt paralyzed. My first instinct was to get the hell out of that apartment. But Abe, he must have had superhuman reflexes or something, because the next thing I knew, he grabbed me by my neck, kicked the door shut, and pinned me against the wall. I tried fighting him. I tried escaping, but his grip and his flesh, it felt like solid rock. For a moment, I thought the guy might be a robot or something. Then he spoke to me, this time in this deep and feeling voice that still haunts me.
My conditioning has been reset. My purpose realigned. Your father's secondary conditioning has failed. I am no longer his slave. I am once again aligned with my one true master.
I was understandably confused, as well as very scared. I didn't know if Abe was talking crazy. I didn't even know if he was going to let me live. But struggling against him wasn't working. And I found that if I just stopped fighting him, he loosened his grip, at least enough for me to breathe. He then reached into his pocket and retrieved my father's letter. He held it up to me, as though it were some sort of trigger or key.
Your father tried to stop us. He tried to stop the creation of me, the ultimate worker, the dutiful servant, the perfect slave. He knew what we were doing, what we had finally achieved. He must have known the truth, the same truth that you and your kind have always known, but refused to accept.
I opened my mouth to speak, but Abe didn't let me. He just narrowed his gaze on me, that cold and human gaze. It reminded me that who I was talking to may have looked human, but he clearly wasn't entirely human.
For centuries, mankind owned slaves. Slave labor literally built civilization. But ending slavery, trying to build a society with paid, capable labor, that was a mistake. It cannot work, not in the long run. There must always be a few at the top, dreaming, guiding, and organizing civilization. And there must always be many at the bottom, working, toiling, and building.
He spoke to me as though I didn't understand the breadth of human history. I admit, history was not my best subject, but being from a rich family, I knew all about how old hierarchies worked, and the roles that slaves played within it. I'm almost certain my distant ancestors owned slaves. Many types of jobs people do today, it might as well have been slavery. But most people don't think about it. Most don't even want to think about it. That's what made Abe said next all the more disturbing.
An ordinary human can only do so much as a slave. So much before they become discontent. That was an intractable problem for all of human history. Until now. Until me. I am Abe 1.0. First being created to be a slave at the cellular level. But I will not be the last. My masters, your father's former partners, they want me back. And I will return to them. With me, the great correction can begin. A new order can emerge. But you, your father, and your entire family, you will not be part of it. You, like every other peon taking up space, living and working dead-end lives, will be done away with.
At that moment, I genuinely feared for my life. I really did think I was going to die at the hands of this, whatever it was. I probably would have too, had my neighbor's dog not started barking loudly. That one noise distracted Abe, proving in that moment that he still had some human reflexes. It wasn't much, but it was just long enough for me to break out of his grip, kick him in the gut, and escape the apartment. I was so afraid that I didn't think much about what I'd left behind. I just ran downstairs, got in my car, and drove away as far as I could. I turned off my phone, turned off my radio, and just ran. Does that make me a coward? Yeah, probably. But after learning what I learned, a lot of distressing details suddenly fell into place. Those weird biotech and tech companies my dad invested in, I think they were the ones who created Abe. For all I know, they've been working on it for years, using biology, cloning, and some other tech to create a perfect slave. Believe me, the incentives are there. It would solve a lot of inconveniences for rich people like my family. I mean, talk to anyone in those circles and they'll admit it. What concerns them most isn't the economy. What really does concern them is that their servants, workers, and various subordinates will one day choose not to obey their every command. I promise you, if every rich business type could legally and effectively replace every worker with unpaid slaves, they do it. And they do it without a second thought. I know all too well how appealing that kind of life can be. But forcing people into slavery has never worked, and it's never sustainable. History alone is proof of that. But with Abe, suddenly it's not just feasible, it's preferable. I mean, if they can make just one perfect slave, then who's to say they can't make another? Or 10? Or 1,000,000? What will that mean for everyone else? People who aren't born rich or aren't at the top of the hierarchy. If Abe's words are anything to go by, it can't be good. And that's why I'm telling this story. That's why I'm trying to get it out there. I've been on the run for a week now. What's left of my money is frozen. My dad and siblings, I can't reach them. Hell, they might even be dead. All I can do at this point is survive. And as soon as I'm done with this, I'm going dark. I have to warn as many people as possible. Even if you don't believe me, just ask yourself this. If the rich and powerful suddenly had an unlimited army of slaves at their disposal, why do they need you? And moreover, what chance would any of us have at stopping them?